Good morning, my friends in Cindy's Corner. Hope this finds you warm and cozy and having a great day. If you've got this book, go get it so you can follow along for story time. It's Mr. Putter and Tabby. Spill the beans. My AR testers, this is a level 3-3. Excuse me. Mr. Putter and Tabby spill the beans. Here's our title page. Our author is Cynthia Rylant. Our illustrator is Arthur Howard. It says, it's chapters, and it says 7 chapters, but they're very one-pagers, okay? Chapter 1 is Neighbors. Mr. Putter and his fine cat, Tabby, live next door to Miss T-Berry and her good dog, Zeke. They were all good friends and neighbors. They liked doing things together. They took long walks. They had tea. And sometimes they tried new things. The new things sometimes worked out, and sometimes they didn't. But every new thing was an adventure. Okay, here, they got the cat in the basket, and they're pulling the dog, riding a 2-cycle. Chapter 2, New and Fun. One day, Mrs. T-Berry called Mr. Putter and said she had an idea for something new to try. Something new and fun, she told him. Mr. Putter was trying to fix his faucet. It was drippy when Tabby tried to sleep in the sink. The water dripped on her head. I hope the new and fun thing fixes faucets, said Mr. Putter. Oh, it's more fun than that, said Mrs. T-Berry. It is a cooking class. A cooking class? Asked Mr. Putter. A cooking class did not sound like something new and fun to him. Are you sure about the fun part? Asked Mr. Putter. Of course, said Mrs. T-Berry. Trust me. When he hung up the phone, Mr. Putter thought about the many times he had trusted Mrs. T-Berry. I'm still not sure about the fun part, he told Tabby. Tabby just purred. The faucet wasn't dripping anymore. She could nap until things became new and fun. Chapter 3, 100 Ways. Mr. Putter and Tabby drove to the cooking class with Mrs. T-Berry and Zeke. Are you sure the class is only beans? Asked Mr. Putter. Yes, said Mrs. T-Berry. We are going to learn 100 ways to cook them. Mr. Putter looked at Tabby. He did not want to learn 100 ways to cook beans when he wanted an ice cream soda. He wanted an ice cream soda with strawberry ice cream and a cherry on top. He did not want beans. He did not want 100 ways to cook them. But he wanted to make Mrs. T-Berry happy. And sometimes their new things worked out. When they had gone to the hair show, he had won a case of shampoo that made a very good doorstop. And when they had gone to the bug festival, he had seen a whole new side of Tabby. Mr. Putter would make the best of beans. Chapter 4, Beans. The cooking class had many students. Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry were the only ones who brought pets. The teacher said Tabby and Zeke were welcome, but they had to stay under the table. Mr. Putter did not think Zeke could stay anywhere longer than 2 minutes, but he didn't tell the teacher that. He also didn't tell the teacher that he wanted an ice cream soda. He told himself to think about beans, only beans, beans. Chapter 5, Granola. When the teacher showed the class the first way to cook beans, Mr. Putter was wide awake. Tabby was purring. Zeke was scratching. And Mrs. Teaberry was taking notes. When the teacher showed the class the 7th way to cook beans, Mr. Putter was yawning. Tabby was purring. Zeke was sniffing. And Mrs. Teaberry was taking notes. And when the teacher showed the class the 14th way to cook beans, Mr. Putter was snoring. Tabby was snoring. Zeke was chewing on somebody's granola bar. And Mrs. Teaberry was taking notes. Zzz, they're snoring. Then the woman who owned the granola bar that Zeke was chewing on decided she needed a snack. She reached under the table to put her hand in her purse, but her hand did not go into her purse. Her hand went into Zeke's sloppy, crunchy, gooey, wet mouth full of granola. He looks scared, doesn't he? See? The woman screamed. Zeke barked. Everybody jumped. The table tipped. And beans started flying everywhere. Chapter 6, Wide Awake. It takes a lot of beans to teach a class about 100 ways to cook them. And it is amazing where beans can land once they start flying. All of a sudden, Mr. Putter and Tabby were wide awake. Mrs. Teaberry had stopped taking notes. Zeke was eating the 1st and the 7th ways to cook beans. And the teacher had fainted. Passed out. It looked as if this was going to be one of those new things that didn't quite work out. There's the teacher. The dog's licking. He's licking him. Licking the teacher. Chapter 7, Sodas. At the ice cream parlor, Mrs. Teaberry helped Mr. Putter pick beans out of his collar. Mr. Putter helped Mrs. Teaberry pour beans out of her purse. And Tabby and Zeke helped each other with a banana split. See, they're eating the banana split there. At last, I learned 14, at least I learned 14 ways to cook beans, said Mrs. Teaberry, and I learned how to sleep standing up, said Mr. Putter. They both took a sip of their ice cream sodas. They both looked at Tabby and Zeke, and they stayed under the table, said Mr. Putter. Yes, said Mrs. Teaberry, at least while it was still standing. So did they stay under the table while the table was standing? But when the table was tumped over, they couldn't stay under it, could they? No. Have you ever eaten beans? Tell me a story about a time that you have had beans and maybe they were really, really good, or maybe they were really, really bad. I remember my first time to cook beans. Oh my, I could make good meals, and I put the beans in the crock pot and they weren't good. We had to throw them out and go get pizza. So it takes a special cook to cook beans. And maybe you want some beans. Have your parents to cook some beans, or your grandparents to cook some beans and cornbread for you. Tell me what you eat with beans. And do you take your pet to class with you? Does it stay under the table? Make sure you share Cindy's Corner with your friends so they don't miss story time with Cindy. And hit that thumbs up button. Have a great day. Tell somebody you love them and give them a hug.